Welcome to the Sikh Messenger Podcast series brought to you by the network of Sikh organisations. Over the next few weeks, we will be interviewing people who are engaged in addressing the issue of hate crime, be it from a policing or public policy perspective, or hearing from victims themselves. Our focus is on the implications for British Sikhs, but we will also be looking at the wider problem in general. This initiative is brought to you as part of the Catch Together Against Hate project, which is being facilitated by Gallup and has been funded by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. Your hosts for the series are Devleen, Herbaksh and Hardeep. This episode, we're delighted to be talking to Hardeep Singh, a freelance journalist, deputy director for the network of Sikh organisations and assistant editor of the Sikh Messenger. He was a leading member of the libel reform campaign, along with science writer Simon Singh and cardiologist Dr. Peter Wilmshurst. He wrote a chapter titled Religious Libel, Are the Courts the Right Place for Faith Disputes? He has written for a number of media outlets, including The Telegraph, The Spectator, The Guardian and The Independent. Along with co-author Dr. Jugbir Jyoti Johal, he co-authored a book entitled Racialization, Islamophobia and Mistaken Identity, The Sikh Experience. He has also been a co-host for this series of podcasts, along with myself and Herbaksh. Hi Hardeep, it's lovely to talk to you today.
Hi Devleen, hi Herbaksh.
Hi.
So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your early life.
Never been asked that question before. So I was born in London. I kind of spent a stint of that time sort of growing up around Southall, as did many of us, from the Punjabi Sikh community.
Yeah.
It was essentially Little Punjab, known as Little Punjab fondly, because it was the centre of a lot of immigration from the Indian subcontinent, in particular Punjab, during the 1960s and 70s. I always had an interest in, Sikhism very early on. I went to a Catholic school, and the teacher at the school, we were taught by nuns, actually. They were some of the teachers, and one of the nuns was responsible for religious education. And we spent about 30 seconds on Sikhism. So this particular nun said, and then there was Guru Nanak, who just made up his own religion. And that was the end of it. That was kind of my insights into Sikhism at school. So that kind of, in many ways, drove a sense of trying to really find out for myself what my religion was about, what Sikhism taught. And I've always been quite an inquisitive person from my early years through to now. I like learning. I always like to develop things and learn new things and get a better understanding of life in general. I guess if I fast forward to 2007, I got involved with the network of Sikh organisations. I met Lord Singh around that time because I was involved in some litigation, and he was the expert witness in a case in which I was involved in. And I haven't kind of looked back since. So over those years, there's been some really exciting and interesting work that we've been involved in. As you know, the charity is responsible for the prison chaplaincy service, the armed forces chaplaincy service, and Lord Singh and the charity have, for very many years, have been involved in improving religious literacy around Sikhism. I mean, in fact, I think it was a diplomat who introduced him as the man that brought Guru Nanak to the breakfast tables of Britain through his Thought for the Day transmissions on Radio 4. So it's a kind of honour to be working with him. He's somebody I kind of grew up knowing about throughout university. He was a figure that a lot of the Sikh societies used to invite to give lectures during those interesting Jar and Samosa parties that everyone used to have. And he's really kind of put Sikhism on the map in the UK. In recent years, we've been involved in helping improve religious literacy still. So there's been a guide that we produced for journalists to help educate them about Sikhism, which is being hosted on the Independent Press Regulator's website, Ep5's website. And of course, we've been involved in UK Parliament Week for the last few years, which aims to help improve engagement within the Sikh community with those in the corridors of power and just getting a better understanding about how democracy in the parliamentary process works. So there's some really interesting work. As you know, I'm also a journalist. So I tend to write about issues of politics, religion, and free speech. Those, are things I'm free speech especially is something I'm very sort of passionate about. I hope that helps address your question.
No, that was really interesting, and I think you do some great work. For those listeners who perhaps haven't heard of the network of Sikh organisations, I know you've talked a bit about the work that we do, but could you give just a brief summary of the aims of the charity?
Yeah, so the charity has a number of organisations. It's an umbrella group, essentially, which has a number of gurdwaras and other Sikh organisations that kind of affiliate to it. And the aims and objectives are in our constitution. We essentially want to raise issues on behalf of the Sikh community with government, with policymakers. We want to have a voice where there isn't a voice, or there's a kind of lacuna in policy. And a great example of that is actually on hate crime, the subject of today's podcast, where the charity has in many ways been leading the issue. So be it through giving evidence to Home Affairs Select Committee on hate crime and its violent consequences, giving evidence to various APPGs that deal with hate crime, be it through raising the plight of Sikhs post 9/11 in debates in Parliament, or through writing about it and talking about it on the radio. That's very much been our bag and something that we've been focused on for the last few years. In fact, although it's the last few years for me, it's been something that Lord Singh himself has been doing ever since 9/11. And I think you guys touched on this when you interviewed him. He took a delegation of Sikhs to Downing Street to meet Tony Blair. So we've got a kind of heavy focus on education, improving religious literacy. As you know, prison chaplaincy is a very key component of it, as well as sort of education and looking after Sikh schools. So that's the kind of other element of the charity.
Hardeep, it's fascinating to hear about the range of work you've been involved with the NSO and also as a journalist. And you touched upon hate crime there, but in terms of your own background, was there anything that you can recall that led you to also be interested in this area of hate crime? And were you ever a victim or a witness of hate crime growing up?
I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. I mean, I've sort of noted how this whole debate has evolved. So when we talk about racism and we sort of cast our minds back to the 1960s or 1970s, when some of our parents kind of first moved to the United Kingdom, there was this sort of terminology called Paki bashing, and that was where members of the National Front would go to places like Southall or other areas where they're the high ethnic minorities, and go and attack Muslims, Sikhs and Hindus, all of whom in their views were Pakis, and they in many ways glorified attacking these members of these ethnic minorities. And certainly growing up, I've been called a Paki many times. It was part and parcel of being at school. It was, I was one of the few Indian children of Indian heritage in school, so I was a Paki. So I've had that experience, and I think that's kind of evolved through to something different now. So we've seen an emergence of a prejudice based on global events. So post 9/11, the landscape changed significantly from, racism of course still exists in its many forms, but what happened for Muslims and Sikhs who were confused for Muslims is there was a negative reverberation of global incidents and Islamic extremism, and a targeting of people who were perceived to be Muslim, and that included Sikhs. And absolutely, I've had my own personal experiences of that. Not quite as bad as some of the other people who I've spoken with or interviewed or we've written about in the volume. But after the Boston bombings, for example, in 2013, I was walking with my rucksack, and three very burly skinheads who looked like they wanted a fight turned to me and said, "Don't press the button." The suggestion being I had some form of explosive device that I was supposed to detonate in my rucksack. I mean, I'm not isolated in this. I mean, I remember chairing a community event in around 2005. I think it was after the London tube bombings. I was chairing it. There was a senior police officer and a politician. And when I proceeded to ask the audience who here has been called Bin Laden, roughly 100 Sikh men put their hands up, indicating the extent of the problem. So I think we've all had our experiences with some forms of prejudice over the years. However, I think that has changed and it's evolved, and it's a reflection of global events.
It's maybe to others it's quite shocking to hear all of these accounts of life growing up in Britain for Asian people. So all of that experience, did it have any role in you writing this book? How did you actually get to write this book? And can you just tell us briefly the name of the book and your co-author?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is it's a bit of a mouthful. It's called Racialization, Islamophobia, Mistaken Identity, the Sikh Experience. Obviously, I can't speak for my co-author, and it's a shame she wasn't able to join us today. I guess my motivation absolutely was because of my experience. But also, I mean, if I may, I'd sort of like to break it down into a few constituent parts. I mean, it's my personal experience, and that of fellow Sikhs in the West. But it was because I increasingly saw a marginalisation of Sikhs in public policy when it came to hate crime. There was a clear lack of focus from the government, with a particular focus on the Muslim and Jewish communities, and it was almost as though Sikhs didn't matter. That's kind of how I felt. There's also a lack of current literature on this subject, in particular the Sikh experience. And I think by no means the least of the reasons why I've written or co-authored this book is because of my very unhealthy obsession with the subject. My obsession with this subject led me to submitting a number of freedom of information requests to the Metropolitan Police, but other police forces as well, over a few years, because I was miffed at where these hate crimes are being recorded, and if the attacks on Sikhs perhaps were being recorded under a different category. And my fears of this came true, because I did some FOIs to the police which showed that 28% of victims of Islamophobic hate crime, as recorded by the Met Police in 2015, were non-Muslims or of no recorded faith. And then I did a subsequent FOI for the year for between January and December 2016 to the Met Police around this category, so Islamophobic hate crime. And that showed that 25% of a total of 1,227 victims of Islamophobic hate crime were non-Muslims and or of no recorded religion. And that comprised of Christians, Hindus, Jews, Sikhs, Buddhists, atheists, and agnostics. And all of this was really essentially driven by the way the police record hate crime. It's based on recommendations from the Macpherson report following the death of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence back in 1999. And this subjective test around how the police measure a hate crime is based on the perception of the victim or any other person. So what this means is these are perception-based recordings. And the other thing which is of interest is, according to the College of Police's hate crime operational guidance, you don't actually need any evidence to corroborate this perception-based hate crime. So if, for example, I say, I think I've been attacked because of racism or for whatever reason, the police can't actually challenge my perception. So no evidence is required. So that's actually something else which is quite remarkable.
Why have you got such an obsession with the subject? Is it your lived experience that has impacted you?
Well, I think it was, again, there was a number of reasons why. It was the lived experience, but it was a quote from a book that was written in 2009. So from the American Sikh perspective, the volume Civil Rights in Wartime, the Post 9/11 Sikh Experience by Sidhu and Gohil. They said Bin Laden's image, complete with the white turban and flowing beard, had been seared into the American consciousness, which was still reeling with grief and anger. The visual connection between a turbaned Bin Laden and a dark-skinned turbaned male had been forged. And of course, that quote in itself is very powerful, but then when you look at actually the consequences of what happened to the Sikh community, especially in the United States, with the initial murder, the first person to be killed in retribution was a gas station owner, Balbir Singh Sodhi, and that was a revenge attack for 9/11. And ironically, Balbir Singh Sodhi had just gone to his local Costco and bought some American flags and displayed them outside his business to show solidarity with the American people following the attack on the Twin Towers. So it was kind of viewing and seeing what was going on in the world and having a very deep-seated sorrow around how the image of Sikhs was being confused in this way, and how actually we all needed to actually do something about this. We couldn't sit down and let this just carry on as it was. And I guess that was the kind of seed for me to pursue this in a bit more of a meaningful way.
I mean, so then how have you found the reactions to the book? Have you met with positive or negative responses, or?
So far, it's been very positive. Sadly, because of COVID, we weren't able to do an official launch, so that's still something that will happen at some point. But I think it's added some value to the literature, and it's been quoted by other organisations, and it's not the kind of book that you'd buy in Waterstones. So when it comes to these sorts of books, it's a very kind of specialised, it's a academic publisher. I know a lot of universities in America have got a copy of the book, and some of the academics here gave us some wonderful testimonials once they'd read it. I think what it does do, it provides a resource and reference for policymakers and for people within Parliament. And I think that's important, because there's been a real lack of focus and attention really to the issue of the Sikh community. And our anticipation is that, you know, this will be something that's important in the future and an important reference as this conversation and this the hate crime debate develops. We certainly need to be part of it, and we certainly need to make some noise. Whereas I think previously the Sikh community has kind of just got on with business and kind of accepted that there is prejudice and it's kind of part of life, but we just kind of need to get on with things. And I think it's important that, yes, that's a very good attitude to have, but at the same time, we also need to start talking about the experiences that we're having, even if they're uncomfortable, or even if you don't necessarily feel that you're important.
It's very interesting you say that, Hardeep, because I think, I mean, if we look back to the podcast, the interview we undertook with Suresh Grover at the monitoring group, you know, a lot of what he was talking about, the struggles of Asian communities in this country, centred in Southall in particular, a large percentage, a good proportion, if not the majority of people involved in those struggles were Sikh. You know, the Indian Workers Association, the Southall Monitoring Group, and the vast population of Southall in those days especially was Sikh. So Sikhs did and were at the forefront actually of the struggles in this country for racial equality, and there was campaigns on the motorcycle helmet, wearing turbans in uniforms, such as on the buses in London, in Wolverhampton. But as you say, I mean, Sikhs have then gone on to perhaps feel that battles have been won, and or we just get on with things. And in the meantime, we have had this rise in hate crime, quite often with this conflation of Muslim and Sikh identities, or Muslim and Asian identity, all being wrapped up in one. And as you say, actually that goes right back to when Asian communities first came to this country, and we were all called the P word. So looking at all of that, and then having written this book, and you say you'd like this book to be something that is drawn upon for policymakers and others. So what are the key recommendations that you and your co-author, I think we should just mention her name and just tell us who she is and where she works. What are the key recommendations that come out of that book?
Yeah, so Dr. Jagbir Jyoti is from the University of Birmingham. And she's also been very much involved over the years in raising the awareness of the kind of hate crime that is suffered by the Sikh community, and in particular sort of the backlash that they've suffered post 9/11. I mean, before I touch on the recommendations, I wanted to, you know, you've reflected on Southall and how the Punjabi and the Sikh community was very much involved in the battle for equality there with the Southall youth movement the events around Blair Peach's murder, and how that became a kind of a seminal moment in the campaign for equality. It kind of beggars belief. I mean, it's something that I don't think any of us can really fathom, where there was such blatant racism, and people, were attacking people just simply because they didn't like the color of their skin or where they came from. I mean, it's something that I guess we take for granted, that, there is racism, but there's also now equality laws. There's the Equality Act 2010, which protects all races and religions from discrimination and prejudice. I mean, one of the things that I think is probably linked around that era, the Southall era that you refer to, is, and I think you touched on Wolverhampton and the campaign for Sikhs to wear the stars on buses. I guess one of the discoveries that I made during researching this book was that actually Enoch Powell, in his famous Rivers of Blood speech, and it's not widely acknowledged, but it's something that I found quite remarkable. But his focus at the time, part of the focus of his vitriol was actually British Sikhs and their demand to wear a turban. And
wow.
he said that actually that, his view was that this would destroy the British way of life. And I'll quote from what he actually says in his speech. The Sikh community's campaign to maintain customs inappropriate in Britain is much to be regretted. Working in Britain, particularly in the public services, they should be prepared to accept the terms and conditions of their employment. I mean, he went on to say that, asking for special rights leads to a dangerous fragmentation within society. And this was around the time of that long-running campaign, I think around 1969, where bus drivers in his constituency were fighting for their right to wear turbans whilst on duty. So, these are, sort of discoveries that you make along the way. And I think one of the other discoveries, which I found even more remarkable, is that even after all of these victories in the court, so the right to wear a turban whilst you're riding a motorbike, the right to wear a turban on buses, after all of these legal victories, after 9/11, a retired police officer who was working in the Met Police at the time, Gurpal Verdi, he actually said that when he was going around police stations after 9/11 to tell officers the difference between the Taliban and the Sikh community in London, they didn't know either.
Wow.
And he says, and this is, I think it's a quote he actually gave to The Guardian at the time. He said, "And this is London, a multicultural area. It doesn't help when they keep showing images of Osama bin Laden in the UK, and it's the Sikhs who wear a turban." So I think if there's two interesting discoveries I made with my co-author whilst researching this volume, it was Enoch Powell absolutely did focus on Sikhs, which isn't something that is discussed very often, or if at all, in the mainstream media. And the second point is that the level of ignorance, not just, amongst knuckle-dragging Neanderthals, but amongst officers in the Met Police who didn't know the difference between the Taliban and the image of a Sikh. If I go to your question around what we want people to do differently, or what are the kind of calls of action, if you like, for us, I mean, what are the recommendations that we're making? One of the main ones would be around improvement of religious literacy. And I'll give you an example of how bad it gets. And forgive me, I'll be using an example from America just to highlight the ignorance, the level of ignorance, and that we have seen over the years. So after the Wisconsin Gurdwara massacre in 2012, we've got obviously an election coming up in America now, but the then US presidential candidate Mitt Romney offered condolences to those friends and families of those who were murdered in the Gurdwara in Oak Creek, referring to them as sheikhs, not Sikhs.
Yeah.
Now,
wow.
Sheikh is an honorific title for an Arab. And a day after the massacre, a Lieutenant General Michael Gold, who's a highly decorated military officer, referred to the killings having occurred in a Sikh mosque. Now, there's a survey in America, SALDEF, which is an advocacy organization. They published a survey in collaboration with Stanford University called Turban Myths. And the takeaway messages from that survey showed that 70% of Americans could not identify a Sikh man in a turban as a Sikh. And almost half believed that Sikh was a sect of Islam. So that's the kind of backdrop of the reasons why, and we can't take anything for granted in this country. I'm not for a minute suggesting that the levels of religious illiteracy in this country are as bad as the examples that I put forward there. However, we can't rest on our laurels and assume that everybody knows anything about our religion or what we stand for, what we represent. So I think one of the key recommendations myself and Dr. Jyoti Joel do make for policymakers, and wherever you can, actually, I mean, this applies to content in the media, it applies to the national curriculum, it applies to all walks of life. It's the responsibility of everybody in our community to help educate people. And I think when it comes to the national curriculum, I think there are inherent challenges when it comes to Sikhism, because most schools focus on Abrahamic traditions at GCSE level, but we can't let good teaching and learning about religion fall off the agenda, and that includes Sikhism. I mean, I don't want, I'd hate it if children growing up had kind of like a couple of sentences about Sikhism like I did when I was at school. But again, there are other challenges at play here. So you've got lobbying from groups like the National Secular Society to include secularism, atheism, and agnosticism within the national curriculum. And of course, this will make it much more challenging for the smaller faiths like Sikhism, whereby the Abrahamic traditions, I'm sure, will be continued to be a sort of priority. One of the other things I think is important, and one of the things that we've recommended, is around community activism. There's no point of people demanding change without actually trying to do something about it. And a good example of where someone has been proactive is Northampton Gurdwara. There's a gentleman called Amarjit Singh Atwal who has worked very proactively with the police in addressing issues of hate crime. And what he's demonstrated is an ability to build long-term and meaningful relationships with the authorities. And I think that's worked really well. So this is essentially what this really requires is a commitment and a drive and an enthusiasm to help improve things for the community. And that's not something you can just kind of hand over to people. That's something that they've kind of is inherently part of them or not. So that's, I guess, a bit more difficult. One of the other recommendations that we've given is in relation to what I guess individuals can do with the media or around social media activism. We need to all ask ourselves the questions: are we talking about the experience? Are we relaying how we feel? Are we putting into perspective the focus around hate crime against Muslims and Jews is in contrast to the focus around other faiths? I mean, these are all important questions. After the attempt to remove the Eco-Sikh guy's turban outside of Parliament in 2018, I think his name is Ravneet Singh, there was a campaign that was organised by one of the Sikh television channels, if I'm correct, a turban tying day in Parliament. So that's an example of activism. But there's many more ways you can do it. And I think those who have really big followings on social media, on Twitter or Facebook, they can do a lot just to get the voice out there. And I believe there was a conservative Sikh campaigner who was accosted outside the Conservative Party headquarters a few years ago by someone who was clearly racist, and then proceeded to sort of spit in his direction when he challenged him. Yeah, I think it's Amandeep Bogle, I believe his name is. And he tweeted that, this is my experience, this is what happened. There was an inference that he was a terrorist because of what he looked like, and he's a turban and bearded Sikh. But that gets traction, that was retweeted so many times. He's got lots of followers, and it's important to do this sort of thing. I think one of the other recommendations is, I think with the way the government is dealing with this issue, needs to be more of a level playing ground, and there needs to be parity for all faiths and none. And some of our recommendations look at where funding has been given, and where there should be consideration to other communities. And I think there are, I don't want to be overly critical of the government. There are some good things to report on as well, and we have done in the volume, and that's around protecting places of worship. And there was a sort of a pot of funding that was put in place by the Home Office specifically. It was one of the recommendations that came out from Action Against Hate, which was the government's 4-year hate crime action plan, which was published in 2016. Now, although it was Abrahamic centric, that was the position of the network of Sikh organizations, there was no examples of hate crime against Sikhs, and the focus was predominantly the Muslim and Jewish communities. There was a commitment to help improve security for places of worship, and we report on how some gurdwaras have actually benefited from that, but much more needs to be done.
So can you tell us, to the best of your knowledge, where does this conflation of Sikh identity with radical Muslim violent extremism come?
So I guess the simple answer to that is that most people would associate it with the direct aftermath of 9/11 and the images of Osama bin Laden that were being sort of transmitted across sort of global television networks, particularly in America, but also over here in the UK. And so that association with a flowing beard and a turban was something that was kind of transfixed in sort of people's minds as the enemy, if you like, of the West. But I think one of the things that isn't often acknowledged, if at all, really, in this discourse is actually that linkage or association with turbans and beards and extremism, if you like, goes back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, with footage of Ayatollah Khomeini, which was transmitted across the West and lampooned in Hollywood films like The Naked Gun. As Chris Allen in his book Islamophobia puts it, he became the epitome of evil, personifying a rampant and uncontrollable anti-Americanism, the antipathy of Western values, morals and beliefs. I mean, what Dr. Allen fails to acknowledge is that Sikhs are the majority turban-wearing communities in the West, and that includes Britain. And so you can see where the problem sort of begins, if you like, when it comes to these symbols.
Very interesting.
All the points that you said I completely agree with. And religious literacy and education is something that I feel has been brought up by a lot of people and mentioned previously on previous episodes of the podcast. How, I know this is a big question, and if there were an easy answer, it probably would have been done by now, but how do you think we can go about making sure that Sikhism and other non-Abrahamic faiths are taught about properly in school, and not even just taught, but taught correctly? I remember at school coming out of a lesson where the teacher had taught us that, Sikhs have long hair because long hair means that you can have a better connection up to heaven and God. And clearly this isn't true. And he would come up to me and say, so cutting your hair is, breaking your connection with God. And that's not quite how it works. And it's quite frustrating that even if when it is taught, it's often misunderstood. How do you think we can resolve these issues?
That's a all-encompassing question, Devlin.
Yeah, sorry, it's a big question.
No, it's important in the context of this volume and all we've been talking about. I think it's incumbent on all of us to, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, to help educate our colleagues, our friends, our associates, our followers on social media, to better understand who we are. Now, if somebody has little knowledge about Sikhism, in some ways we've got to take some responsibility for that. And in some ways, although I find it objectionable, I can sympathize why they'd get confused with the image of a Sikh with bin Laden or ISIS, for example. And there's been many cases where that has happened, and sadly there's been some violent repercussions to that as well, and we've illustrated that with many examples in the volume. But I'd certainly say that, I guess as a journalist, the media is an important platform for everyone to consider. You don't necessarily have to write articles yourself, but perhaps you could, if you're a member of a local Sikh community, say if you're in West London and there's some events going on, maybe you want to pick up the phone and invite a local journalist from your local newspaper. And I know there's efforts underway. There's organisations who are doing this already, like the Sikh Press Association. But then I guess what that means is upskilling. So, if people are going to be trying to get the stories out there, it's how do you, for example, how do you write a good press release? How do you capture the attention of somebody who's got 1,000 emails in their inbox, and how do you stand out, and how do you get kind of a story out there? These are very important skills to learn. So my suggestion would be that it's incumbent on the community ourselves. Other people aren't going to educate people about Sikhism. Buddhists aren't going to all of a sudden wake up one day and think, well, we need to educate everyone about Sikhism. It's about what we do, and it's about the difference that we make. And I think a very good example of the difference that has been made is the work that Harbaksh has been involved in, the UK Punjab Heritage Association. I mean, he'll probably be able to tell us the figures and the numbers of people that went to the exhibitions and learned about Sikhism, the press coverage, which was not just national, but it was international. And I remember talking to an enthusiast who was into collecting medals from the Great Wars, who attended the exhibition on the contribution of Sikhs to World War One. And he was just blown away by the content. So again, although that's history and that's a kind of part of the story, it also helps educate people about ethos, values, and tradition of the community. So I think all of these things are really important.
Well, thanks for that answer, Hardeep. I mean, it's very comprehensive what you've just said, and I guess you're right about the work of the UK Punjab Heritage Association. I think a happy byproduct of it has been that we've been able to reach non-Sikhs with information and this history, which completely coincides with British history and is British history in many ways. And you're right to say what you said about the education system, about the work of the Sikh community itself in advocating for itself and letting the world know who we are. But if we come back to your book and the issue of the conflation of Muslim and Sikh identity and radical, violent Muslim extremists and Sikhs, there is an argument that says that, yes, this is all very well, and it's very important for us to explain who we are. But in doing so, are you, in actual fact, by refuting, I think to an extent the NSO and others would say this concept of Islamophobia and these Abrahamic-centric terms kind of negate or reduce the importance of other faith groups in terms of their victimization? Are you, in actual fact, by talking about Islamophobia and trying to separate Sikhs from this label, are you, as a byproduct, throwing Muslims under the bus?
When it comes to definitions of hate crime, I think my view and the view of the charity is that anti-Muslim hate is a much better term, similar to anti-Sikh or anti-Christian or anti-Hindu. And to help illustrate this, we don't refer to the 1984 anti-Sikh genocide as Sikhophobic. When it comes to the word Islamophobia, it is a vacuous and amorphous term, which, if you like, is a catch-me-all phrase. And it has actually been weaponized against those within the Muslim communities themselves, who, for example, oppose gender segregation in schools or forced hijab wearing. You've had liberal and secular Muslims, ex-Muslims, gay, bisexual and transgender campaigners who have all been called Islamophobes for voicing their opinion to Muslim clerics on issues such as women and gay rights. I mean, one of the things that we did do, we did oppose the APPG Islamophobia definition and got a lot of criticism for that. And the definition, just for those who don't know, is the definition is Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Now, the first thing to observe is, how do you define Sikhness or Muslimness for that matter? a Baroness Faulkner, who's a Liberal Democrat peer, talked about how her and her family were considered insufficiently Muslim because they came from India pre-partition, and that she went to an elite convent school, the same one as the only Pakistani female prime minister, and her and her family were treated very badly because of it. I mean, let's take Sikhness, for example. Some Sikhs would say that I'm insufficiently Sikh for not having an open flowing beard, or perhaps my kirpan isn't quite long enough for their liking. And I'm sure both of you have faced this kind of judgment within the community. The question is, who decides? Is it those who speak the loudest? And I think if that's the case, then we're in difficulty. And it kind of tallies with, we've been quite consistent on this as a charity. So as most people will know, the network of Sikh organisations has opposed the campaign for a Sikh ethnic tick box in the 2021 census. Our position is that the Equality Act 2010 already protects all victims of racial and religious hatred, and Sikhism is a religion. It's not a racial group. And I think the same argument comes into play when it comes to this Islamophobia definition, because if you're basing it around racism and you're saying it's a biological characteristic, you're suggesting that all Muslims are a racially homogenous group. And therefore what you're doing is you're marginalizing European Muslims, be it Bosniak, Kosovars or Albanians, as well as converts to Islam. So I think we've certainly been consistent. I mean, I'll illustrate it with another example. Now, some of the victims of Islamophobia, if you like, have been white hipsters with beards. Now, it wasn't because of their race that they were targeted. It was because of their beards. So we could say that it's, if you want to make things really complicated, it's Islamophobia driven by pognophobia. And the other thing, of course, is when we think of this in the context of the Sikh community, you had members of 3HO, which is Healthy, Happy, Holy organization, which is this movement created by Yogi Bhajan, which has, of course, come under a lot of controversy in recent months because of the publication of a book by Prem Kaur, which talks about abuse. But at the time of 9/11, 3HO in America, which consisted mainly of white and Hispanic Sikhs, they also suffered a backlash. And again, it's not because of the color of their skin, but it was because of the conflation of religious symbols and beards rather than their racial heritage. And I think the other thing to say, Harbaksh, is that, we can't have this conversation in isolation. I'm sure you'll agree that it's wrong to use the word Islamophobic to point to the persecution of non-Muslims in Muslim-majority countries, where the Kafirs, which is a derogatory term for non-Muslims, are treated like an underclass, dehumanized, and in some cases murdered. There's some horrific cases that you hear about coming from countries like Pakistan. There's forced marriage of minority community girls, that includes Hindus, Sikhs, Christians. We had the targeted killing of 25 Sikhs in a Gurdwara in Kabul not that long ago. I think it was May of this year. The ISIS, did those killings. And I don't think it's Islamophobic to point to the fact that you've got 10 or so nations in the world today that have death sentences for apostasy. We've got to be able to discuss these issues without being censored with the accusation of being racist.
Yeah, that's some fascinating points there, Hardeep. Absolutely fascinating. And it's really good to hear you speak so knowledgeably about such a broad range of interconnected issues. It's been an absolute pleasure and incredibly enlightening listening to you speak.
Yeah, it really has. I was just wondering what your plans are going forward. Do you have any ambitions to perhaps write another book? What have you got planned for the future?
I'd love to write another book, Devleen. I'm not too sure what that would be. I don't think at the moment, I don't feel it's going to be an academic book. Perhaps I'll try going into another area. Perhaps I really like children's books. So maybe something to help improve religious literacy, which is aimed for children, which will be entertaining for children, but also provide them a bit of background about the gurus and Sikhism. I mean, that would be a great ambition to have, and something that
I think that would be lovely.
I'd love to do. And maybe it'd be illustrated by someone like Quentin Blake. I mean, it was a
that
illustrator.
would be incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an illustrator that I kind of grew up with, having kind of even I actually met Roald Dahl as a boy, and I loved all his books. I've been reading James and the Giant Peach recently, again myself, which is probably something I didn't really need to volunteer, but I have.
Well, it's nice to know more about the fuller, broader picture of who you are, Hardeep. And a book like that would be most welcome, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you for asking me all those questions.
It was really lovely talking to you. And yeah, I look forward to reading your children's book one day.
That would be great. Thanks, guys.